Hey everyone, tonight we begin with the pounding headache that connects us across centuries, that unmistakable throb behind your eyes, the queasy roll in your stomach, and the desperate promise to whatever deity might be listening that you'll never drink again if they just make it stop. Tonight we're diving into how our medieval ancestors dealt with the morning after misery. And trust me, their solutions were far more creative and considerably more dangerous than anything you'll find in your medicine cabinet. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Picture this, it's 1347, and Brother Thomas has made what he's already recognizing as a catastrophic error in judgment. The monastery's celebration of Saint Eligius's feast day got considerably more enthusiastic than usual, thanks to a particularly potent batch of ale that the brewmaster had been experimenting with. Now, as the first pale light of dawn creeps through the stone arches, Thomas finds himself face down on the cold flagstones of his cell, his mouth tasting like something had crawled in there and died, which, given medieval dental hygiene, wasn't entirely out of the question. So Thomas does what any sensible medieval person would do. Mindest Habers to the infirmary and begs Brother Benedict, the monastery's resident medical expert, for salvation. And Benedict, bless his heart, has just the thing. He reaches for a small vial containing what he calls his morning restoration elixir, a delightful concoction of crushed pearls, powdered unicorn horn, and the dried liver of a rabid dog, all suspended in wine that's been blessed by no fewer than 3 different saints. But here's where our story gets interesting, because Brother Thomas doesn't have the luxury of calling in sick, popping some ibuprofen, and binge-watching Netflix until he feels human again. No, Thomas has lords to attend in about 20 minutes, and showing up looking like death warmed over isn't going to fly with the abbot, who has very specific opinions about monks who can't handle their ale. Benedict's medical training came from years of studying at the monastery's scriptorium, where he'd painstakingly copied texts from ancient Greek and Roman physicians, adding his own observations and those of his predecessors. His medical chest contained dozens of small vials and pouches, each carefully labelled in his neat monastery script. There was powdered mummy, yes, actual ground-up Egyptian mummies, which were considered a panacea for almost everything. There were stones from the stomachs of various animals, each believed to counteract specific poisons. There were herbs gathered at particular phases of the moon, blessed water from holy springs, and even vials of what he claimed was the breath of saints, captured in bottles and sealed with blessed wax. But Benedict's cure was actually on the tame side, compared to what was happening in the wider medieval world. In the courts of nobles, where hangovers were practically a professional hazard, the remedies got considerably more elaborate. Take Lady Margaret de Clare, a 14th century noblewoman who was known for throwing parties that would make a modern college fraternity look like a church picnic. Her personal physician, Master Geoffrey, had developed what he proudly called the Noble's Revival, which involved placing the patient in a tub filled with warm milk, while servants rubbed their feet with crushed mint and sang specific hymns in Latin. Now, before you start thinking Brother Benedict was some kind of medieval quack, understand that he was actually following the most advanced medical knowledge of his time. Medieval medicine operated on the theory of the 4 humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, and a hangover was clearly the result of an excess of hot, moist humours that needed to be cooled and dried. The pearls were for cooling, the unicorn horn for purification, and the rabid dog liver, well, that was for the sheer drama of it all. Whether it actually worked is debatable, but Margaret swore by it, probably because lying in a warm milk bath while people sang to you and rubbed your feet was infinitely preferable to dealing with a hangover the hard way. The psychological benefits were probably enormous, and the warm milk did provide some hydration and electrolytes, even if absorbed through the skin wasn't the most efficient delivery method. The theory here was that the milk would draw out the poison through the skin, while the mint would stimulate the humours and the Latin hymns would appeal to God's mercy. Lady Margaret's milk baths required the services of at least 6 dairy cows, which had to be milked fresh that morning by servants who had fasted overnight to ensure their spiritual purity didn't contaminate the cure. The milk was then heated to exactly the right temperature, judged not by thermometer, which didn't exist, but by testing it against the inside of the wrist, just as you test a baby's bottle today. The servants assigned to foot rubbing duty had to undergo special training. They learned specific pressure points that were believed to correspond to different organs, and they had to memorize the exact sequence of hymns that would be most pleasing to the Almighty. Getting the job was actually quite prestigious, as it paid well and came with the perk of observing noble life up close, though it also came with the risk of being blamed if the cure didn't work. The preparation of these curative wines was an art form in itself. The herbs had to be gathered at specific times. Wormwood was most potent when picked at dawn on a Tuesday. Fennel needed to be harvested during a full moon, and dragon's blood resin had to be scraped from trees that had been struck by lightning. The wine itself had to come from grapes that had been blessed by a priest, and the entire mixture had to be aged in barrels that had been consecrated with holy water. The key was timing. This curative wine had to be consumed at the exact moment when the sun reached its zenith, while facing east, and after reciting a prayer to Saint Adrian, the patron saint of brewers. Miss any of these steps, and you might as well resign yourself to a day of misery. The prayer to Saint Adrian was particularly elaborate, beginning with a formal greeting, moving through a detailed confession of the previous night's excesses, and concluding with a promise to moderate future drinking as, though everyone involved understood this last part, was more aspirational than binding. But perhaps the most popular medieval hangover cure was something called hair of the dog, though their version was considerably more literal than ours. Medieval physicians genuinely believed that the best cure for overindulgence was more alcohol, but it had to be the right kind of alcohol, prepared in the right way, at the right time. They would take wine and infuse it with herbs like wormwood, fennel, and something called dragon's blood, which was actually a tree resin, though I'm sure they were disappointed to learn that. Now you might be wondering how they even knew what time it was, given that accurate timekeeping was still a bit hit or miss in medieval Europe. Well, that's where things got creative. Many monasteries and noble households employed what they called timekeepers, usually young boys whose job it was to watch the sun and shadows and ring bells at appropriate intervals. These kids became surprisingly good at judging time, partly because their job literally depended on it, and partly because they were usually the ones sneaking sips of ale when no one was looking, so they had a vested interest in hangover timing. But the real champions of medieval hangover cures were the common folk in the taverns and alehouses. These people didn't have access to powdered unicorn horn or personal physicians, so they had to get creative with whatever was at hand, and what they came up with was often surprisingly effective, if occasionally terrifying. The timekeepers used ingenious methods to track the passage of hours. They had elaborate sundials carved into courtyard stones, marked with the positions for different prayers and activities. They watched the shadows of specific architectural features. A particular gargoyle or window arch might cast shadows that indicated important times. Some even used water clocks, where water dripped at a steady rate from one container to another, though these required constant maintenance and weren't very portable. These dock workers had developed a whole ritual around their river cure. They would strip down to their undergarments, regardless of the weather, forming a line along the muddy riverbank. The most experienced drinker would go first, demonstrating the proper technique: a quick prayer, a deep breath, then a headlong plunge into the murky water. The others would count out loud, timing how long he could stay under. When he emerged, gasping and shaking, he would pronounce whether he felt the evil humours departing, and the next man would take his turn. The competitive aspect was crucial. Nobody wanted to be the one who couldn't hold his breath as long as the others, so men would push themselves to dangerous limits, sometimes passing out and having to be pulled from the water by their companions. The shock therapy aspect probably did help with some hangover symptoms, though the risk of drowning, hypothermia, or contracting waterborne diseases was considerable. Take the cure favoured by the dock workers in medieval London. After a night of serious drinking, they would head down to the Thames at dawn and plunge their heads into the river while holding their breath for as long as possible. The theory was that the shock of cold water would drive out the evil humours, while the effort of holding their breath would restore proper circulation. The fact that the Thames in medieval London was essentially an open sewer probably added some additional motivation to get your head out of the water as quickly as possible. Another popular folk remedy involves something called sweat singing. Groups of hungover individuals would gather in the hottest room they could find, usually near a bakery's ovens, and sing drinking songs at the top of their lungs until they were literally dripping with sweat. The idea was that you could sweat out the poison while the singing would restore your spirits. Whether it worked or not, it certainly created a strong sense of community among the sufferers. The physical effects were actually quite beneficial. The heat promoted sweating, which helped with dehydration, and the deep breathing required for sustained singing improved circulation and oxygenation. The social bonding was probably just as important. Sharing your misery with others made it more bearable, and the laughter that inevitably accompanied the sillier songs probably triggered the release of endorphins. The sweat singing sessions were elaborate affairs. Participants would arrive at the bakery before dawn, when the ovens were being heated for the day's bread. The baker would usually charge a small fee for the privilege of using his workspace, and sometimes he'd provide small cups of ale to keep the singers' voices lubricated. The songs had to be specific ones, usually ballads about legendary drinkers or humorous tales of drinking mishaps. The theory was that by singing about drinking, you were somehow completing a spiritual circle that would neutralize the negative effects. The reverse toast had elaborate rules and protocols. The apologies had to be made in order of age, from oldest to youngest, and each person had to confess their specific sins against the ale. Maybe someone had mixed different types of alcohol, or drunk without eating, or failed to properly toast their companions. The confessions were often quite creative, and sometimes hilarious, as people tried to outdo each other in describing their transgressions. But perhaps the most ingenious common folk cure was the reverse toast. This involved gathering all the people you had been drinking with the night before, and having each person apologize to the ale itself for overindulging. They would hold up their cups, bow deeply, and recite a formal apology that usually began with something like, "Noble ale, we have wronged thee through our greed and weakness." The ceremony would conclude with everyone taking a single, ceremonial sip of watered-down ale, while promising to show proper respect in the future. The psychology behind this was actually quite sophisticated. It transformed the hangover from a purely physical punishment into a social ritual that reinforced community bonds and provided a structured way to process the shame and regret that often accompanies overindulgence. Plus, the small amount of alcohol probably did help with the withdrawal symptoms, while the watering down prevented further intoxication. The knowledge was passed down from mother to daughter through careful observation and oral tradition. Young women would learn to identify healing plants, understand which combinations worked best for different types of discomfort, and master the timing and preparation techniques that made the difference between an effective remedy and useless leaf water. This knowledge was considered part of a woman's essential skills, along with cooking, sewing, and managing a household. Medieval women had their own special approaches to hangover cures, often based on herbal knowledge that had been passed down through generations. They would brew teas from willow bark, which actually contains salicin, a precursor to aspirin, mixed with honey and various aromatic herbs. These remedies were often more effective than the elaborate concoctions favoured by male physicians, though they were dismissed as women's remedies and not taken seriously by the medical establishment. Women's hangover remedies were typically more practical and less theatrical than men's cures. They focused on gentle hydration, basic nutrition, and soothing herbs, rather than dramatic rituals or exotic ingredients. A typical women's cure might involve a tea made from willow bark, chamomile, and mint, sweetened with honey and sipped slowly while sitting in a quiet, dimly lit room. Simple, effective, and without the need for unicorn horns or rabid dog livers. One particularly clever cure involved what they called dream ale. Women would take regular ale and let it sit overnight in the moonlight, covered with a cloth that had been embroidered with protective symbols. In the morning, they would strain it through clean linen and drink it slowly while visualizing the headache flowing out of their body like water. Whether the moonlight actually did anything is questionable, but the ritual of slow, mindful drinking and positive visualization probably had genuine therapeutic benefits. The embroidered cloths used for dream ale were often family heirlooms, passed down through generations and considered to have accumulated power through repeated use. The symbols varied by region and family tradition, but common motifs included stars, moons, healing herbs, and protective animals. The act of embroidering these cloths was itself considered therapeutic, and many women would work on them during their own recovery from overindulgence, stitching their intentions for future temperance into the fabric. The church, meanwhile, had a complicated relationship with hangover cures. On one hand, they officially disapproved of excessive drinking and considered hangovers a just punishment for sin. On the other hand, practical considerations often won out, especially when important members of the community needed to function despite their poor decisions. This led to the development of what were called penance, cures, remedies that were supposed to cure your hangover while also making you suffer appropriately for your sins. These often involved extremely unpleasant ingredients like ground beetles, bitter herbs, and vinegar, mixed together in combinations that were guaranteed to make you question your life choices. The theory was that if you suffered enough while taking the cure, God would consider your debt paid and restore your health. Some of the more extreme penance cures required the sufferer to maintain a specific posture while the remedy took effect. You might have to kneel on stone floors for hours, or stand with your arms outstretched in the shape of a cross, or even crawl on your hands and knees around the entire perimeter of the church. The physical discomfort was considered essential to the cure's effectiveness. The church's approach to hangover cures reflected broader theological debates about suffering, redemption, and the nature of divine justice. Some clergy argued that any attempt to alleviate hangover suffering was interfering with God's will and preventing the sinner from learning proper lessons. Others maintained that healing was a Christian duty, and that cures were acceptable as long as they included appropriate elements of penance and spiritual reflection. These cure sellers were often colourful characters with names like Remedy Ralph or Salvation Sally. They would show up just before dawn with carts full of mysterious bottles and packets, calling out their wares to the stumbling crowds emerging from all-night drinking sessions. Their remedies ranged from the merely useless to the genuinely dangerous, but they did a booming business because desperation makes people surprisingly willing to try anything. The crawling cure was particularly popular during Lent, when public displays of penance were encouraged. Hungover penitents would make their way around the church's exterior, stopping at each station to recite specific prayers and consume small amounts of bitter herbs. The entire process could take several hours, and by the end, the original hangover was usually forgotten in the face of scraped knees, aching backs, and the bitter taste of wormwood. But perhaps the most interesting aspect of medieval hangover cures was how they varied by social class. The wealthy had access to exotic ingredients and elaborate rituals, while the poor made do with whatever they could find. This created a whole underground economy of hangover remedies, with enterprising individuals setting up shop outside taverns to sell morning cures to desperate customers. His standard cure involved a complex ritual where customers had to state their drinking history, confess their excesses, and promise future moderation before receiving the draught. While they drank, Pierre would wave his staff over their heads and recite what sounded like incantations, but were actually nonsense syllables mixed with fragments of church Latin. The whole performance took about 10 minutes, cost a substantial amount, and left customers feeling like they had received something truly special. Master Pierre's success lay in his understanding of theatre and psychology. He would set up his cart in the town square, just as the cathedral bells rang for dawn prayers, timing his arrival perfectly for maximum impact. His white donkey was trained to bow when he rang a small bell, and his costume included a flowing cape covered with embroidered stars and moons. He spoke in a mixture of Latin and French, using just enough medical terminology to sound authoritative while remaining comprehensible to his customers. The most successful cure sellers understood that presentation was everything. They would dress in elaborate robes, carry impressive-looking equipment, and speak in authoritative voices about humours and planetary influences. One famous cure seller in medieval Paris, known as Master Pierre the Wise, would arrive each morning in a cart pulled by a white donkey, wearing a hat decorated with bells and carrying a staff topped with what he claimed was a piece of the true cross. His celestial restoration draught was probably just wine mixed with herbs and honey, but people swore by it, partly because the entire experience was so memorable that it distracted them from their suffering. Winter hangover cures were particularly elaborate because they coincided with the holiday drinking season. The 12 days of Christmas, various saints' feast days, and winter festivals provided numerous opportunities for overindulgence, and each celebration seemed to require its own specialized cure. The Christmas hangover cure involved mulled wine with special spices, consumed while sitting by a fire and listening to carols. The New Year cure required eating 12 grapes at midnight while making resolutions about future drinking habits. The seasonal variations in hangover cures were also fascinating. Winter remedies focused on warming the body and driving out cold humours, so they often involved hot broths, heated wines and spices like ginger and cinnamon. Summer cures were designed to cool overheated systems, featuring cold water treatments, fresh herbs and fruit-based concoctions. Spring hangover cures were particularly elaborate because they coincided with various religious festivals and seasonal celebrations. These often involved renewal rituals, where the sufferer would symbolically shed their winter self and emerge refreshed for the new growing season. This might include washing with water that had been blessed on Easter morning, eating the first fresh herbs of spring, or even rolling naked in the morning dew, though this last option was usually reserved for the very desperate or the very brave. The tools and equipment used for medieval hangover cures were as varied as the remedies themselves. Wealthy households might have specialized cups made from materials believed to have curative properties, carved horn cups for their cooling properties, silver vessels to purify the contents, or even cups made from rhinoceros horn, which was supposed to neutralize poisons. The poor made do with whatever was available, though they often developed ingenious ways to enhance their simple remedies. Horn cups were particularly prized because different animals were believed to have different medicinal properties. Cups made from unicorn horn were the ultimate prize, though given that unicorns didn't actually exist, these were usually made from narwhal tusks or carefully carved cattle horns. Staghorn cups were believed to be particularly effective against poisons, while ram's horn cups were thought to enhance masculine vitality. The Easter hangover cure was especially complex, involving a 3-day process that began on Good Friday with fasting and bitter herbs, continued on Saturday with cleansing rituals, and concluded on Easter Sunday with a feast of specific foods that were believed to restore balance to the humours. The symbolism of death and resurrection was explicitly connected to the hangover experience. The death of the previous night's excess and the resurrection of sobriety and health. The belief in memory stones was based on the idea that objects could absorb and store experiences, particularly traumatic or significant ones. A stone that had witnessed many successful hangover cures would accumulate healing power, while a stone from a place associated with moderation and virtue could transmit those qualities to the holder. Some families maintained collections of memory stones, each with its own history and specific applications. The role of music in medieval hangover cures deserves special mention. Different types of music were believed to affect the humours in specific ways, so the choice of songs or instruments could be crucial to a cure's success. Soft, flowing melodies were thought to soothe agitated humours, while rhythmic drumming could help restore proper circulation. Some cures required complete silence, while others demanded that the patient sing specific songs at precise intervals. One common technique was the use of memory stones, special rocks that sufferers would hold while taking their cure. These stones were usually chosen for their colour, texture, or the circumstances under which they were found. A stone found at a crossroads was considered especially powerful, while a stone that had been struck by lightning was worth its weight in gold for hangover purposes. Weather played a huge role in determining which cures were appropriate. Rainy days called for warm, drying remedies, while sunny weather favoured cooling treatments. Some cures could only be performed during specific weather conditions. You couldn't do a proper morning dew cure without actual dew, and certain herbal preparations were believed to be most effective when prepared during thunderstorms. The most elaborate musical cures involved hiring professional musicians to play sequences of carefully chosen pieces while the patient underwent treatment. This was obviously expensive, so it was mostly limited to the wealthy, but the concept trickled down to common folk who would organise informal singing groups or recruit local musicians to help with their hangover remedies. Professional musicians who specialised in healing music were highly sought after and well paid. They had to master not only the technical aspects of their instruments, but also the theoretical knowledge of how different musical modes affected the human body and spirit. A skilled healing musician could diagnose a patient's condition by observing their responses to different musical phrases and adjust the treatment accordingly. The thunderstorm cure was particularly dramatic and dangerous. It required the sufferer to stand outside during an actual thunderstorm, holding a metal rod and reciting prayers while rain poured down. The theory was that lightning contained divine energy that could purify the body and drive out evil humours. The practice was officially discouraged by the church, but it persisted in rural areas where people believed that divine intervention was the only cure for serious overindulgence. This weather dependence meant that serious drinkers had to become amateur meteorologists, watching the sky and planning their recovery strategies based on the forecast. It also meant that some hangovers lasted much longer than others, simply because the right weather conditions for the preferred cure might not appear for days. The most dedicated medieval hangover sufferers kept detailed journals tracking which remedies worked best under different conditions. These journals were often passed down through families like precious heirlooms, containing generations of accumulated wisdom about the delicate art of morning after recovery. Some of these journals have survived to the present day, and they make for fascinating reading, part medical text, part personal confession, part weather almanac. Regional variations in hangover cures reflected local customs, available ingredients, and cultural beliefs. Northern European cures often involved ice and snow, taking advantage of the cold climate to shock the system back to health. Mediterranean cures emphasized fresh fruits, olive oil, and seawater, while mountain communities developed cures using pine needles, mineral springs, and high-altitude exposure. One surviving journal from a 15th century merchant describes over 200 different hangover cures that he tried over the course of 30 years. His entries show a progression from simple folk remedies to increasingly complex treatments, reflecting both his growing wealth and his deteriorating tolerance for alcohol. His final entries describe cures that took days to complete and required the services of multiple specialists. The journals reveal the deeply personal nature of hangover cures and the trial and error process that each individual went through to find their optimal recovery strategy. Entries might include detailed descriptions of drinking sessions, weather conditions, moon phases, companions present, foods consumed, and the effectiveness of various remedies. Some writers developed elaborate rating systems, scoring different cures on their speed, completeness, and side effects. Italian cures often incorporated religious elements more heavily than those in other regions. The pilgrimage cure required the sufferer to visit 7 different churches, consuming a different herbal remedy at each one, while praying to specific saints associated with healing and temperance. The walking between churches provided exercise and fresh air, while the religious aspect offered spiritual cleansing alongside physical recovery. French cures were typically more refined and focused on food pairings. The morning feast cure involved consuming a carefully planned sequence of foods, starting with bitter herbs to stimulate digestion, progressing through various cheeses and breads to absorb toxins, and concluding with sweet fruits and honey to restore energy. Each course had to be paired with specific wines that complemented the healing process. The German regions were famous for their brewmaster's cure, which involved consuming a specific sequence of different types of beer, each designed to counteract the effects of the previous one. This cure could take all day and required the services of an experienced brewmaster who understood the complex interactions between different brewing techniques and ingredients. As our tale winds toward its end, we return to Brother Thomas, still kneeling in the monastery infirmary as Brother Benedict prepares his elaborate cure. The crushed pearls have been mixed with wine, the unicorn horn powder has been blessed 3 times, and the dried dog liver has been ground to a fine powder. Thomas takes the cup with trembling hands, says a quick prayer, and downs the entire concoction in one gulp. And you know what? He actually feels better. Whether it's the placebo effect, the alcohol content of the wine base, some genuine medicinal properties of the ingredients, or simply the relief of having done something proactive about his condition, Thomas manages to make it through Lourdes without disgracing himself. He even manages to hit most of the right notes during the hymns, though his voice sounds like he's been gargling with gravel. The taste is indescribable, metallic from the pearls, bitter from the herbs, with an underlying funkiness from the dog liver that makes Thomas's already queasy stomach do somersaults. But Benedict isn't finished. He produces a small bell and begins ringing it in a specific pattern while chanting in Latin. Thomas is instructed to close his eyes and visualize the evil humors leaving his body through his fingertips, which he does with the desperate concentration of a man who has no other options. Brother Benedict carefully records the success in his medical journal, noting the specific ingredients used, the phase of the moon, the weather conditions, and Thomas's reported level of recovery. This information will be used to refine future cures and will eventually be copied and shared with other monastery infirmaries throughout the region. The success of Thomas's cure becomes monastery legend, retold and embellished with each telling. Within a few years, other monks are specifically requesting Brother Thomas's cure when they find themselves in similar straits, and Benedict begins preparing larger batches of the mixture to meet demand. The recipe is eventually written down and included in the monastery's official medical texts, where it remains long after both Thomas and Benedict have been laid to rest in the monastery cemetery. But the real lesson here isn't about the effectiveness of medieval hangover, though some of them probably worked better than you'd expect. It's about how human ingenuity and desperation can lead to the most elaborate solutions to universal problems. Medieval people didn't have our modern understanding of metabolism, dehydration, or neurotransmitters, but they understood that hangovers were a problem that needed solving, and they threw everything they had at finding solutions. In many ways, medieval hangover cures reveal something fundamental about human nature, our eternal optimism that there must be a shortcut, a secret remedy, a way to have our cake and eat it too. We may have better chemistry and cleaner ingredients now, but we're still fundamentally the same creatures, still looking for that magic cure that will let us indulge without consequences. The elaborate nature of many medieval hangover cures served psychological functions that were probably just as important as any physical effects. The complexity of the rituals forced sufferers to focus on something other than their misery, while the social aspects provided community support and shared experience. The investment of time, money, and effort in a cure made people more likely to believe it was working, and the ceremonial aspects provided a sense of completion and renewal. Their cures were a fascinating blend of medical theory, religious belief, folk wisdom, and pure wishful thinking. They were often expensive, usually unpleasant, sometimes dangerous, and occasionally effective. But most importantly, they gave people something to do with their suffering, a way to feel like they were taking control of their situation, rather than just enduring it. And maybe, just maybe, Brother Benedict's pearl and unicorn horn elixir wasn't so different from our modern hangover remedies after all. They're both about hope, ritual, and the deeply human belief that tomorrow can be better than today, even if today started with your face on a cold stone floor, wondering why you thought that last cup of ale was such a good idea. The ingredients may have changed, but the fundamental human experience, the desperate search for redemption after overindulgence, remains exactly the same across the centuries. Picture yourself receiving an elegant invitation written in flowing script on thick cream paper, sealed with burgundy wax, and delivered by a liveried footman. Mrs. Charlotte Pemberton requests the honour of your presence at dinner this Saturday evening at 7 o'clock, sharp. Your heart should flutter with excitement, but instead you feel a cold dread settling in your stomach, because in 1847, accepting a dinner invitation wasn't just committing to an evening of pleasant conversation and good food, it was signing up for a grueling endurance test that could literally kill you. Let's start with the most immediate problem: getting there alive. Your invitation specifies 7 o'clock, but what it doesn't mention is that dinner won't actually be served until at least 9:30, and possibly as late as 11. This isn't because Mrs. Pemberton is running behind schedule. This is entirely intentional. The fashionable dining hour has been creeping later and later throughout the century, and arriving at the stated time would mark you as hopelessly provincial. But here's the catch. You can't eat anything substantial before you go, because doing so would be seen as an insult to your hostess. So you'll spend the next 6 hours in an increasingly desperate state of hunger, watching other equally famished guests pretend they're not slowly dying inside while making polite conversation about the weather and the latest parliamentary debates. Those 6 hours aren't just filled with pleasant socializing either. Oh no, that would be far too simple. Instead, you'll be subjected to what the Victorians called drawing room entertainment, which sounds delightful until you realize it consists of tone-deaf amateur piano recitals, endless recitations of mediocre poetry, and parlor games that make watching paint dry seem thrilling by comparison. Take charades, for instance. What starts as a simple guessing game becomes an elaborate theatrical production where Mrs. Pemberton's unmarried daughter Constance performs an 18-minute interpretive dance representing the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, while everyone sits frozen in their uncomfortable chairs, applauding politely at what they hope are appropriate moments. Miss Constance has been preparing this performance for weeks, and her mother has specifically arranged tonight's guest list to include eligible bachelors who might be impressed by her daughter's artistic sensibilities. Then there's the dreaded musical evening, where every guest is expected to perform something, whether they have any talent or not. The piano bench becomes a torture device as nervous guests stumble through half-remembered pieces, their sweaty palms slipping on the keys, while everyone else maintains expressions of rapt attention. Mrs. Pemberton herself will inevitably perform a 20-minute operatic selection in a voice that could shatter crystal, while her husband nods approvingly and the rest of the company contemplates various forms of escape. But let's say you survive the pre-dinner entertainment and finally make it to the dining room. Surely now your ordeal is over. Think again. Victorian dinner parties weren't meals. They were elaborate theatrical productions designed to demonstrate wealth, sophistication, and social superiority, with the actual consumption of food being almost incidental to the main purpose. First, there's the seating arrangement, which has been planned with the precision of a military campaign. Mrs. Pemberton has consulted multiple etiquette books, considered the social standing of every guest, and arranged the placement cards with the delicacy of a diplomat negotiating a peace treaty. Your position at the table isn't random, it's a carefully calculated statement about your place in the social hierarchy, and everyone in the room knows exactly what that placement means. If you find yourself seated near the foot of the table, congratulations, you've just been publicly ranked as one of the least important people in the room. If you're placed next to the vicar's maiden aunt, who's known for her lengthy monologues about her cats, well, that's Mrs. Pemberton's way of telling you that your conversation skills are considered roughly equivalent to those of someone who talks primarily to felines. But even if you're fortunate enough to secure a good seat, your troubles are just beginning, because Victorian dinner parties featured what they called service à la Russe, a newfangled French system where courses were served sequentially rather than all at once. This sounds civilized until you realize it means you'll be sitting at that table for approximately 4 hours, consuming somewhere between 7 and 15 different courses, each with its own specific set of utensils, rules, and social expectations. The place setting in front of you looks like a surgical instrument display. There are forks for fish, forks for meat, forks for salad, forks for dessert, and special tiny forks for fruit that you're expected to use, even though your fingers would be infinitely more practical. There are knives for butter, knives for fish, knives for meat, and special blunt knives for cheese that couldn't cut warm butter if your life depended on it. The spoon selection includes soup spoons, dessert spoons, teaspoons, and mysterious specialized spoons whose purpose remains unclear even to the servants. Using the wrong utensil isn't just a minor faux pas, it's a social catastrophe that will be discussed in drawing rooms across the city for weeks. Mrs. Pemberton and her guests are watching your every move, ready to pounce on any sign that you don't belong in polite society. Pick up the wrong fork, and you might as well pack your bags and move to the countryside where your shame can't follow you. The first course arrives, a clear soup that tastes like hot water with delusions of grandeur. You're expected to consume this while making pleasant conversation with your dinner companions. But there's a catch: you can't actually talk while you're eating, because that would be barbaric. So you take a spoonful of soup, wait for a pause in conversation, make a witty observation about the latest novel everyone's reading, then return to your soup before it gets cold. Except the conversation never really pauses, because everyone else is playing the same game. So you end up either talking with your mouth full like a savage, or sitting in hungry silence like a simpleton. And that's just the soup course. Next comes the fish, which arrives as an elaborate architectural construction that bears little resemblance to anything that ever swam in the ocean. The Victorian obsession with presentation means your fish has been moulded, stuffed, decorated, and garnished until it looks more like a centerpiece than food. It's surrounded by an array of mysterious sauces, each with its own purpose and proper application method that you're somehow supposed to know instinctively. The fish is followed by what the menu calls removes, large joints of meat that are ceremoniously carved at the table by the host himself. This carving performance is another opportunity for social display, as a gentleman's skill with a carving knife is considered a mark of his breeding and education. Poor Mr. Pemberton stands at the head of the table, sweating through his evening clothes as he attempts to carve a massive roast while 20 pairs of eyes judge his technique. One wrong cut, and his reputation as a proper gentleman is forever tarnished. But here's where things get really nightmarish. You're not just eating one meat course. Oh no, that would be far too simple. There's the roast beef, followed by the lamb, then the veal, possibly some venison. If Mr. Pemberton has been shooting, and definitely several different preparations of poultry. Each meat comes with its own array of side dishes, sauces, and vegetables, and you're expected to sample everything while expressing appropriate enthusiasm for your hostess's menu planning skills. By the fourth meat course, you're beginning to feel like one of those geese being force-fed to produce foie gras. Your corset or waistcoat is cutting into your increasingly distended stomach, and you're starting to wonder if it's possible to actually explode from overeating. But showing any sign of discomfort would be the height of rudeness, so you continue smiling and nodding while internally cursing the day you accepted this invitation. The conversation throughout this ordeal is just as challenging as the eating. Victorian dinner party conversation was governed by strict rules about appropriate topics, proper timing, and social hierarchies. You couldn't just chat about whatever came to mind. Every comment had to be carefully calculated to demonstrate your wit, education, and good breeding, while avoiding any subject that might be considered controversial, unseemly, or boring. Politics was generally off limits, unless everyone at the table shared the same views, which was unlikely given the carefully calculated guest list. Religion was acceptable only in the most general terms. You could discuss the beauty of last Sunday's sermon, but debating theological questions was absolutely forbidden. Money was never mentioned directly, though everyone was constantly evaluating each other's wealth based on subtle clues like the quality of their clothing, the cut of their jewelry, and their familiarity with expensive luxury items. This left a surprisingly narrow range of safe topics: the weather, recent social events, books that everyone had read, theatrical performances that everyone had seen, and carefully sanitized gossip about people who weren't present. The challenge was to discuss these mundane subjects in a way that seemed sparkling and sophisticated, which required a level of verbal dexterity that would challenge a professional entertainer. The ladies at the table faced additional conversational challenges. They were expected to be charming and entertaining, but not too clever or opinionated. They could discuss literature, but only novels, poetry, and essays were considered too intellectual for feminine minds. They could mention their charitable work, but only in the most general terms, and they absolutely could not discuss anything that might be considered indelicate, which ruled out most of the interesting aspects of life. Meanwhile, the gentlemen had to navigate their own conversational minefield. They were expected to be knowledgeable about current events, but not pedantic. They could discuss their business interests, but only in vague terms that didn't suggest they were actually engaged in anything as vulgar as making money. They were supposed to be witty, but not at the expense of anyone present, and they had to show appropriate deference to their elders while not appearing subservient to their social superiors. The servants hovering around the table added another layer of complexity to the entire experience. Victorian dinner parties required an army of domestic staff, each with specific roles and responsibilities that had to be coordinated with military precision. Footmen served the food, parlour maids cleared the plates, the butler supervised the wine service, and everyone moved in a carefully choreographed dance that was supposed to appear effortless but required weeks of preparation. But here's the thing about having so many servants around: they hear everything. Every whispered comment, every private joke, every slightly inappropriate observation gets absorbed by these supposedly invisible people, who will then share it with servants in other households throughout the city. The servants' network was more efficient than any modern social media platform. An indiscreet dinner conversation could destroy reputations faster than you could say "pass the salt." The wine service alone was enough to drive a guest to distraction. Different wines were served with each course, and each wine had its own special glass that had to be placed in precisely the right position relative to your plate. The footman would appear silently at your elbow, pouring small amounts of various wines that you were expected to appreciate while continuing your conversation. Refusing wine was considered eccentric, but drinking too much was social suicide, so you had to maintain a delicate balance between abstemiousness and excess, while pretending to enjoy beverages that often tasted like liquid punishment. The worst part was that you couldn't just sip and forget about it. Victorian wine culture required guests to comment knowledgeably on each selection, its vintage, its provenance, its particular characteristics, and how well it complemented the food. This meant you had to develop an extensive vocabulary of wine appreciation terms and deploy them convincingly, while your palate was being assaulted by an endless succession of different flavors. Some hosts took particular pride in serving rare or unusual wines that would test their guests' sophistication. Mr. Pemberton might produce a bottle of something obscure from his travels, watching carefully to see who could identify it correctly and who would be exposed as a fraud. Getting it wrong wasn't just embarrassing, it marked you as someone who pretended to knowledge you didn't possess, which was considered a serious character flaw. As the evening wore on and the courses kept coming, the physical discomfort became almost unbearable. Those elaborate Victorian clothes that looked so elegant in fashion plates became instruments of torture after 4 hours of sitting and eating. Ladies' corsets, designed to create impossibly tiny waists, made breathing difficult under normal circumstances and became genuinely dangerous when combined with massive amounts of food. Gentlemen's high-collared shirts and tight-fitting evening coats weren't much better, creating a strangling sensation that intensified with each course. The chairs themselves were another form of torture device. Victorian dining chairs were designed for appearance rather than comfort, with straight backs that forced you to maintain perfect posture throughout the entire meal. Slouching or leaning back was considered slovenly, so you had to sit ramrod straight for hours while your back screamed in protest and your legs went numb from the hard seats. But perhaps the most exhausting aspect of the entire ordeal was the constant performance required of every guest. You couldn't just be yourself, you had to be the carefully polished version of yourself that met Victorian social expectations. Every gesture had to be graceful, every comment had to be appropriate, every facial expression had to convey the right combination of interest, appreciation, and refinement. This meant you couldn't scratch an itch, adjust your clothing, or even shift position in your chair without considering how it would be interpreted by the other guests. Yawning was absolutely forbidden, no matter how tired you became during the interminable meal. Showing any sign of boredom, discomfort, or impatience would mark you as ill-bred and ensure that you'd never be invited to another respectable dinner party. The conversation had to be maintained at the same artificial level throughout the evening. You couldn't let your guard down for a moment, because someone was always listening and evaluating your wit, your education, and your social worthiness. One poorly chosen word, one moment of authenticity, one glimpse of your actual personality, and your carefully constructed social persona could come crashing down. Even the act of eating required constant vigilance. Every bite had to be taken with the proper utensil, chewed with the mouth closed, and swallowed discreetly. You couldn't take too large a portion, but taking too small a portion suggested you didn't appreciate your hostess's efforts. You had to eat steadily enough to keep pace with the other guests, but not so quickly that you appeared greedy or uncouth. The endless parade of courses created its own special form of psychological torture. Just when you thought surely the meal must be nearing its end, another course would appear. After the multiple meat courses came what the Victorians called entremets, elaborate side dishes that were really just excuses to prolong the meal even further. These might include savoury jellies, complicated vegetable preparations, and mysterious concoctions that seemed designed more to impress than to nourish. Then came the game course, because apparently multiple preparations of domesticated animals weren't sufficient. You also needed to consume various wild birds that had been shot, stuffed, and roasted until they resembled small leather footballs. The game was often accompanied by elaborate stories about the hunting expedition that had procured it, forcing you to express enthusiasm for sporting activities you had no interest in, while choking down meat that tasted like it had been marinated in disappointment. But even after consuming enough protein to feed a small village, you weren't done. The sweet courses were yet to come, and Victorian dessert service was just as elaborate and interminable as everything that had preceded it. There were multiple desserts, each requiring different utensils and different levels of appreciation. The ice cream course alone could take 30 minutes, as servants presented various flavours in elaborate moulded shapes that were supposed to provoke gasps of admiration. The final courses included fresh fruit, which sounds refreshing until you realise that Victorians had turned fruit consumption into another complex social ritual. Each type of fruit had its own proper method of consumption, its own special utensils, and its own etiquette rules. Eating an orange required a specific peeling technique. Grapes had to be consumed in a particular manner, and don't even think about biting directly into an apple like some kind of barbarian. By the time the meal finally, mercifully ended, you had been sitting at that table for nearly 5 hours. Your body ached. Your brain was exhausted from the constant social performance, and you had consumed enough food to sustain you for a week. But your ordeal still wasn't over, because Victorian social customs demanded that the ladies retire to the drawing room while the gentlemen remained at the table for port and cigars. This gender segregation meant that just as you thought you might finally be able to relax, you were separated from half the company and forced into another round of carefully managed social interaction. The ladies gathered in the drawing room for what was supposed to be intimate conversation, but was actually another performance, this time focused on demonstrating feminine accomplishments like needlework, music, and the ability to discuss literature without appearing too intellectual. Meanwhile, the gentlemen remained in the dining room for what they called serious conversation, which usually meant political discussions that had been forbidden during the mixed company portion of the evening. This was when the real business of the dinner party often took place. Business deals were hinted at, political alliances were formed, and social hierarchies were reinforced through careful displays of knowledge and influence. The port and cigar ritual had its own elaborate protocols. The port had to be passed in a specific direction. Each gentleman had to make appropriate comments about its quality, and everyone had to pretend to enjoy cigars that often produced enough smoke to choke a horse. The conversation was supposed to be masculine and substantive, but it was just as carefully managed as the dinner table discussion had been. After an hour or so of this segregated socializing, the company would finally reunite for coffee and more drawing room entertainment. By this point, everyone was exhausted, overfed, and desperate to go home, but leaving too early would be considered rude. You had to endure at least another hour of stilted conversation and amateur performances before you could finally make your escape. But even your departure had to be carefully orchestrated. There was a specific order in which guests were expected to leave, based on their social standing and their relationship to the hosts. Leaving too early or too late could cause offence, and the manner of your departure would be scrutinised and discussed long after you were gone. The carriage ride home provided the first opportunity to drop the social mask you had been wearing for the past 8 hours. Finally alone, you could acknowledge the physical discomfort, the mental exhaustion, and the sheer relief of having survived another Victorian dinner party. But even as you loosened your collar or unlaced your corset, you were already dreading the thank you note you would have to write the next day, expressing your gratitude for an evening that had been endured rather than enjoyed. The thank you note itself was another minefield of social expectations. It had to be written on the correct paper, in the proper format, with just the right tone of appreciation. Too effusive, and you would appear vulgar and grasping; too restrained, and you would seem ungrateful and ill-bred. The note had to reference specific aspects of the evening: the quality of the food, the charm of the company, the elegance of the arrangements, without being too specific or too general. And here's the truly insidious part. Despite all this suffering, you would probably accept the next invitation that came your way, because refusing dinner invitations was social suicide in Victorian society, and being excluded from these elaborate torture sessions was somehow worse than enduring them. Your social standing, your business prospects, your marriage opportunities, and your general position in society all depended on your willingness to participate in this elaborate charade of civilized dining. The Victorian dinner party was ultimately a perfect example of how social rituals can become completely divorced from their original purpose. What had once been a simple act of hospitality, sharing food with friends and neighbours, had evolved into an elaborate test of social worthiness that served more to exclude than to include, more to intimidate than to welcome. The irony is that most of the participants were probably just as miserable as you were. Mrs. Pemberton spent weeks planning the event, worried constantly about whether everything would go smoothly, and probably enjoyed the actual evening less than anyone. The other guests were all playing the same exhausting game, maintaining the same artificial personas, and counting the minutes until they could escape. But admitting this mutual misery would have been the ultimate social transgression. Everyone had to pretend that these elaborate dinner parties were the height of civilized pleasure, that spending 8 hours in formal clothes, consuming excessive amounts of food, while making stilted conversation was somehow the pinnacle of sophisticated living. The whole system was maintained by a collective delusion that this was how refined people were supposed to live, and anyone who questioned it was clearly too crude and unsophisticated to understand the finer things in life. It was a perfect example of how social pressure can turn even the most basic human activities into elaborate forms of torture, all in the name of civilization and refinement. So the next time you complain about a boring dinner party or a meal that runs a little long, remember poor Mrs. Pemberton's guests, trapped for 8 hours in an elaborate performance of social respectability, longing for nothing more than a simple sandwich eaten in comfortable clothes while having an actual conversation with people they genuinely liked. Victorian society may have achieved remarkable things in terms of technology, literature, and empire building, but they definitely didn't have dinner parties figured out. In the early morning darkness of Edwardian London, a sound strikes terror into the hearts of respectable citizens, the clip-clop of horse hooves on cobblestones, followed by the gentle clink of glass bottles. It's 5:30 a.m, and Harold Wickham is making his morning milk rounds, completely unaware that half the neighbourhood is peering at him through their lace curtains with a mixture of suspicion, fascination, and outright dread. Because in 1908, the Milkman isn't just delivering dairy products. He's carrying deadly weapons in those innocent-looking bottles, wielding the power to destroy reputations with a single whispered conversation, and serving as an unwitting agent of social chaos in a society that's desperately trying to maintain its rigid moral order. The fear wasn't entirely irrational, mind you. Harold's milk rounds put him in a unique position that no other tradesman enjoyed, depending on your perspective. While the baker delivered his goods to shops and the butcher conducted his business in full view of the public, Harold had legitimate reasons to visit private homes at ungodly hours when most decent people were still in their beds. He possessed keys to back doors. He knew which families were early risers and which preferred to sleep late. And most dangerously of all, he had regular contact with the servants, who knew absolutely everything about their employers' private lives. The milk delivery system itself was a masterpiece of intimate access that would make a modern security expert break out in cold sweats. Harold didn't just leave bottles on doorsteps like some primitive Amazon delivery. Oh no, that would have been far too simple and far too safe for everyone involved. Instead, he let himself into people's homes through their unlocked back doors, tiptoed through their kitchens in the pre-dawn darkness, and filled their milk jugs directly from his churns while the family slept upstairs. This system had evolved for perfectly practical reasons. Fresh milk spoiled quickly in an era before reliable refrigeration, so daily delivery was essential. Leaving bottles outside in London's unpredictable weather would result in frozen or soured milk, and the city's population of stray cats, dogs, and enterprising thieves made outdoor storage impractical. The solution was to give trusted milkmen access to customers' homes where they could leave fresh milk in cool pantries and cellars. But here's where things got complicated. Harold's pre-dawn kitchen visits meant he often encountered household staff who were already up preparing for the day. Kitchen maids, scullery maids, and cook's assistants would be starting fires, preparing breakfast, and generally bustling about their morning duties. These chance encounters created opportunities for conversation, and conversation between servants and tradesmen was how information flowed through Edwardian society, like water through a sieve. The servant network was more efficient than any modern intelligence agency. Kitchen maids who learned juicy gossip from the milkman would share it with their counterparts in other households when they met at the market or on their afternoons off. These stories would travel across the city in a matter of hours, growing more dramatic and scandalous, with each retelling until minor domestic disputes became tales of adultery, financial ruin, and social disgrace. Harold himself was generally a decent, hard-working man who minded his own business and just wanted to complete his rounds without incident. But he couldn't help what he saw and heard during his visits. When Lady Pemberton's kitchen maid mentioned that her mistress had been receiving mysterious letters that made her cry, Harold didn't mean to file that information away in his memory. When he noticed that the Ashworth family's milk consumption had suddenly doubled despite no apparent increase in household size, he didn't deliberately draw conclusions about possible secret house guests. And when young Mrs. Fletcher's cook confided that her employer had been asking unusual questions about which herbs might help with women's troubles, Harold certainly didn't intend to become privy to intimate family secrets. But the information accumulated anyway, creating a detailed mental map of neighborhood drama that Harold carried with him from house to house. And sometimes, despite his best intentions, little pieces of this information would slip out in casual conversation with other servants, who would then share it with their friends, who would mention it to their employers during idle moments, until suddenly everyone in the district was buzzing with whispered speculation about who was having affairs, who was in financial trouble, and who might be expecting unexpected additions to their family. The milk delivery route itself was a carefully orchestrated invasion of privacy that would horrify modern homeowners. Harold had memorized the schedules of dozens of households. He knew which families took early breakfast and which preferred to sleep late, which homes had dogs that might bark, and which had servants who were heavy sleepers. He could navigate through unfamiliar kitchens in complete darkness, locating milk jugs and cream pitchers by feel while avoiding furniture, pets, and sleeping servants. This intimate knowledge of domestic routines meant that Harold often knew more about a family's daily habits than their own relatives did. He knew which houses had late-night visitors, because he could see the extra dirty glasses in the morning. He knew which families were struggling financially, because their milk orders would suddenly decrease or switch to cheaper grades. He knew which households were preparing for special occasions, because the cook would request extra cream and butter for elaborate desserts. The most dangerous aspect of Harold's position was his access to the servants' quarters, where the real power in Edwardian households actually resided. While the family upstairs maintained their carefully polished public facades, the servants downstairs knew the truth about everything. The master's drinking problem, the mistress's gambling debts, the eldest son's unsuitable romantic entanglements, and the daughter's secret correspondence with inappropriate suitors. Kitchen maids were particularly valuable sources of information, because they saw everything and everyone who came through the service entrance. They knew which tradesmen were overcharging their employers, which visitors were welcomed warmly, and which were received coldly, and which family members were popular with the staff, and which were universally despised. They also had access to the family's private correspondence, since they were often asked to post letters or receive deliveries, giving them opportunities to observe handwriting, note return addresses, and sometimes even glimpse the contents of carelessly sealed envelopes. Harold's early morning conversations with these servants created a dangerous information exchange that respectable society desperately wanted to control, but couldn't. The kitchen maid might mention that her employer had been crying over mysterious letters, not realizing that Harold would unconsciously file this information away, and possibly share it later with another servant who would put two and two together and realize that Mrs. Pemberton's tears coincided with her husband's extended business trips and the sudden appearance of a handsome new groom in the neighborhood. The social implications of this servant milkman network were terrifying to the upper classes, who relied on maintaining strict control over information about their private lives. Their carefully constructed public images depended on keeping family scandals, financial difficulties, and personal failings hidden from their peers. But the servant network made this impossible, creating an underground information superhighway that could destroy reputations faster than any newspaper scandal sheet. The fear of milkmen wasn't just about gossip, though it was also about their potential for blackmail and social manipulation. A milkman who learned compromising information about a customer's family could use that knowledge to demand better payment terms, favorable treatment, or even outright bribes to keep quiet. While most milkmen were honest tradesmen with no interest in extortion, the potential for abuse was always there, creating a constant undercurrent of anxiety in households that depended on daily milk delivery. Harold's route took him through neighborhoods where a single whispered rumor could destroy a family's social standing forever. In Edwardian society, reputation was everything. It determined who would receive you socially, who would do business with you, which clubs would accept your membership, and most importantly, which families would consider marriage alliances with your children. A rumor that a family was in financial difficulty could make it impossible for their daughters to find suitable husbands, while suggestions of moral impropriety could result in complete social ostracism. The timing of milk delivery made the situation even more precarious. 5:30 in the morning was when most people were at their most vulnerable, disheveled, half-dressed, and unprepared for social interaction. Harold might accidentally encounter family members in states of undress, overhear private conversations through thin walls, or witness domestic disputes that families thought were private. These glimpses behind the carefully maintained facade of respectability were exactly what Edwardian society was desperate to prevent. The route itself was a carefully planned invasion that required Harold to know the intimate details of dozens of households. He had to remember which families preferred their milk left in the pantry versus the scullery, which customers wanted cream separated from milk, and which households had special dietary requirements that required different products entirely. This meant Harold carried in his head a detailed database of family preferences, household routines, and domestic arrangements that would have been worth a fortune to society gossips and scandal sheets. But perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the milkman's access was his ability to observe changes in household routines that might indicate family crises. A sudden increase in milk consumption might mean unexpected house guests, while a decrease could signal financial difficulties or family members traveling. A request for extra cream might indicate preparations for entertaining, while a switch to cheaper milk grades could suggest economic troubles that the family was trying to hide from their social circle. Harold also had access to information through his other customers, creating opportunities for dangerous cross-referencing of gossip and rumor. A servant in one household might mention that their employer had been acting strangely, while a servant in another house might report unusual visitors, and Harold might unconsciously connect these pieces of information to realize that Mr. Ashworth's business meetings coincided perfectly with Mrs. Fletcher's afternoon headaches, and draw conclusions that could destroy both families if shared with the wrong people. The milk delivery schedule created other opportunities for observation that made families nervous. Harold's regular visits meant he could track the comings and goings of family members with uncomfortable accuracy. He knew which households had members who came home very late or left very early, which families received visitors at unusual hours, and which homes showed signs of domestic discord through details like untouched breakfast settings or servants who looked like they'd been crying. The seasonal nature of milk delivery added another layer of complexity to the social dynamics. In summer, when windows were open and voices carried further, Harold might overhear conversations that were meant to be private. In winter, when houses were sealed against the cold, he might notice unusual heating patterns that suggested rooms were being used at odd hours or by unexpected occupants. The changing patterns of milk consumption throughout the year also provided clues about family circumstances that observant milkmen could piece together into detailed pictures of domestic life. Harold's access to multiple households in the same neighborhood created opportunities for comparison that were particularly dangerous to families trying to maintain false impressions about their circumstances. He could see which houses were genuinely prosperous and which were maintaining appearances through careful economy. He knew which families ate well and which were cutting corners on nutrition to afford their social obligations. He could observe the real hierarchy of wealth and status in the neighborhood, which often differed significantly from the public perception that families worked so hard to maintain. The fear of milkmen was also connected to broader anxieties about the changing nature of domestic service in Edwardian England. The traditional master-servant relationship was becoming more transactional and less personal, making it harder for employers to ensure the loyalty and discretion of their staff. Servants were increasingly mobile, moving between households and carrying information with them, and tradesmen like milkmen served as conduits for this information exchange that employers couldn't control. The rise of trade unions and worker organizing also made employers nervous about the power that servants and tradesmen were beginning to wield. A milkman who was mistreated by a customer could potentially organize other tradesmen to boycott that household, creating shortages of essential goods that would be both inconvenient and socially embarrassing. The knowledge that Harold possessed about his customers' private lives gave him a form of power that traditional social hierarchies hadn't accounted for. The geographic scope of milk delivery routes meant that milkmen like Harold served as unwitting intelligence networks that spanned entire districts of the city. Information that started in one neighborhood could travel across London through the network of milkmen, servants and tradesmen, creating opportunities for blackmail and social manipulation that extended far beyond the original source of the gossip. A scandal that began in Mayfair could destroy a family's reputation in Belgravia within a matter of days, carried by this invisible network of domestic workers and delivery personnel. The technological changes of the Edwardian era were also making the milkman's position more powerful and more threatening. The expansion of telephone networks meant that information could travel even faster than before, while improvements in transportation allowed milkmen to cover larger territories and connect previously isolated neighborhoods. The rise of mass circulation newspapers created a hungry market for scandal and gossip that made the information carried by milkmen increasingly valuable and dangerous. Harold's delivery cart itself was a mobile headquarters for information gathering and dissemination. As he moved through his route, he encountered other tradesmen, servants, and delivery personnel who were all part of the same informal intelligence network. A chance conversation with the baker's boy might reveal that the Pemberton family was ordering less bread, while a chat with the coal delivery man could confirm that they were also cutting back on heating, suggesting financial difficulties that could be confirmed or denied through careful observation of other details during milk delivery. The weather added another dimension to the milkman's access and influence. Rainy days meant longer conversations with servants who were reluctant to venture outside, creating more opportunities for information exchange. Snow and ice made delivery more difficult, but also more memorable, as Harold's assistance with difficult deliveries or his reliability during harsh weather created bonds with servants that made them more likely to share confidential information. Hot summer days meant open windows and doors that provided glimpses into private family life that were normally hidden from outsiders. The class dynamics of milk delivery created additional tensions that made families uncomfortable. Harold was technically a tradesman, which placed him below the middle and upper classes in the social hierarchy, but his intimate knowledge of their private lives gave him a form of power that traditional social structures couldn't contain. He might be socially inferior, but he knew secrets that could destroy people who were supposedly his betters, creating a dangerous inversion of the normal power relationships that governed Edwardian society. The The economic aspects of milk delivery also created opportunities for the kind of social pressure that respectable families feared. Harold knew exactly how much each family spent on dairy products, which provided clues about their real financial situation that might contradict their public image. A family that was trying to maintain an impression of prosperity while secretly struggling with debt could be exposed by their gradual reduction in milk orders, their switch to cheaper grades, or their delays in paying their weekly bills. The seasonal social calendar added another layer of complexity to the milkman's potentially dangerous knowledge. Harold knew which families were preparing for elaborate entertaining based on their increased orders for cream, butter, and specialty dairy products. He also knew which families were quietly economizing during expensive social seasons by reducing their everyday consumption to afford special occasions. This information could be used to embarrass families who were pretending to a level of prosperity they couldn't actually maintain. The intimate nature of food consumption made milk delivery particularly revealing about family circumstances. Harold could track changes in household composition through consumption patterns, the arrival of new babies, the departure of family members for school or marriage, the presence of long-term house guests, and even the health status of family members through their changing dietary requirements. This biological intelligence was particularly valuable because it was difficult to fake and impossible to completely hide. As our tale draws toward its conclusion, we return to Harold making his quiet rounds through the sleeping city, completely unaware of the anxiety his presence creates in the houses he serves. He's just a working man trying to make an honest living, delivering fresh milk to families who need it, building relationships with servants who appreciate his reliability and friendly demeanor, and occasionally sharing harmless gossip that makes the long, lonely hours of early morning delivery more pleasant. But to the families behind those lace curtains, Harold represents everything they fear about modern life. The breakdown of traditional social barriers, the democratization of information, and the erosion of their ability to control their public image. He's a symbol of how the modern world was making privacy impossible and putting power in the hands of people who weren't supposed to have it. The irony is that Harold probably knew more about the real lives of his customers than their own family members did. He understood their financial situations better than their bankers, their domestic dynamics better than their relatives, and their personal struggles better than their closest friends. He had achieved this intimate knowledge not through any deliberate espionage, but simply by doing his job conscientiously and building friendly relationships with the people he encountered during his daily rounds. The fear of milkmen in Edwardian England was really a fear of social change itself. The recognition that the old ways of controlling information and maintaining social hierarchies were breaking down under the pressure of modern urban life. The milkman was just one symptom of a larger transformation that was making the private public, the personal political, and the intimate dangerous. In the end, Harold would complete his rounds, return home to his own family, and probably never realize the impact his presence had on the lives of his customers. He was simultaneously the most trusted and most feared person in the neighborhood, trusted enough to have keys to people's homes, feared enough to keep them awake at night, worrying about what he might have seen or heard during his morning visits. The age of the milkman would eventually pass, replaced by more efficient but less personal forms of dairy distribution. But for a brief moment in history, men like Harold Wickham wielded a unique form of power that came from being simultaneously invisible and omnipresent, trusted and suspect, essential and dangerous. They were the unwitting agents of social revolution, destroying the comfortable illusions of privacy and control that had sustained the old world while helping to create the more democratic but less predictable society that would replace it. So the next time you complain about a delivery person who rings your doorbell at an inconvenient time. Remember Harold Wickham and his fellow milkmen who had the keys to your house, knew all your secrets, and could destroy your reputation with a casual conversation over a cup of tea in someone else's kitchen. Modern delivery might be less convenient in some ways, but at least the Amazon driver doesn't know whether you're having an affair, struggling with debt, or hiding family scandals that could ruin you if they ever became public knowledge. Brother Aldrich has a problem that would drive a modern person to invest in industrial-strength noise-cancelling headphones and possibly relocate to a remote cabin in the wilderness. It's 3:47 a.m. on a Tuesday in the year 1398, and he's trying to complete his copying of St. Augustine's Confessions in the monastery scriptorium when the unholy racket begins again. Not the sacred sounds of lauds, or the gentle murmur of prayers, mind you, but the earth-shaking symphony of Brother Godfrey's snoring, echoing through the stone corridors like a wounded dragon with respiratory problems, accompanied by the enthusiastic nocturnal activities of the monastery's population of rats, who apparently hold competitive racing events in the walls every night, between midnight and dawn. But here's the thing that would absolutely mystify anyone living in our modern world of white noise machines and soundproofing. Brother Aldrich can't just pop in some earbuds, crank up a meditation app, or move to a quieter location. No, he's bound by centuries of monastic tradition, vows of obedience, and a complex theological framework that treats every noise as either a test from God, a message from the divine, or a manifestation of demonic interference that must be dealt with through prayer, patience, and increasingly creative forms of spiritual warfare. The medieval monastery was, paradoxically, both a sanctuary of silence and an echo chamber of the most maddening sounds imaginable. These massive stone structures, designed to inspire awe and facilitate contemplation, were also acoustic nightmares that amplified every footstep, magnified every whisper, and turned the simple act of dropping a quill pen into a thunderclap that could be heard 3 corridors away. The soaring vaulted ceilings and hard stone surfaces that created such beautiful architectural spaces also created perfect conditions for sound to bounce around like a demented ping-pong ball, gathering strength and persistence as it travelled. Brother Aldrich's particular torment began each day at exactly 2 a.m, when the monastery's schedule called for the night office of vigils. This should have been a peaceful time of prayer and meditation, but instead it marked the beginning of what he privately called the daily symphony of suffering. First came the creaking and groaning of hundreds of wooden bed frames as his fellow monks reluctantly dragged themselves from their straw mattresses. Then the thud-shuffle of sandaled feet on stone floors, punctuated by the occasional crash when someone misjudged a step in the darkness. The monastery bells, those symbols of divine regularity and spiritual discipline, were actually instruments of acoustic torture when you lived directly beneath them. When the bell ringer pulled those ropes at the canonical hours, the bronze giants above would swing into motion with a resonance that seemed to penetrate not just your ears, but your very bones. The sound waves would travel down through the bell tower, through the stone walls, and into every corner of the monastery complex, creating vibrations that made your teeth ache and your concentration scatter like startled pigeons. But Brother Godfrey's snoring was the crown jewel of nocturnal disturbance. This wasn't your garden variety snoring. This was a geological phenomenon that seemed to emerge from some deep cavern in the man's chest and echo through the dormitory like the breathing of a slumbering giant. It followed a predictable pattern that made it somehow even more maddening, a long whistling inhale that built in pitch and intensity, followed by a moment of blessed silence that offered false hope, then an explosive exhale that sounded like a blacksmith's bellows being operated by an enthusiastic apprentice. The really diabolical aspect of Godfrey's snoring was its timing. It seemed calibrated to begin just as Aldrich reached the most delicate parts of his manuscript copying, when he needed absolute concentration to form the tiny, precise letters that would preserve sacred texts for future generations. The snoring would start softly, almost subliminally, just enough to make him aware that something was disturbing his focus, but not enough to identify the source. Then it would gradually increase in volume and complexity until it dominated the acoustic environment and made concentrated work impossible. Medieval monks had developed an entire theological framework for dealing with noise disturbances, based on the understanding that everything in creation served God's purpose, even the most annoying and disruptive sounds. Brother Aldrich had been taught that unwanted noise was either a test of his patience and devotion, a reminder of the fallen state of the world, or an opportunity to practice the virtue of acceptance. This meant that complaining about noise was not just impractical but actually sinful, a sign of spiritual weakness and insufficient trust in divine providence. The monastery's approach to noise control was therefore primarily spiritual rather than practical. Rather than trying to eliminate disturbing sounds, the monks were encouraged to transform their relationship with those sounds through prayer, meditation, and what they called holy listening. This involved techniques like incorporating the rhythm of disruptive noises into their prayer patterns, using repetitive sounds as aids to contemplation, and finding spiritual meaning in even the most mundane or annoying auditory experiences. Brother Aldrich had tried all the officially sanctioned approaches to dealing with noise disturbance. He had practiced prayer weaving, where he attempted to synchronize his recitation of psalms with the rhythm of Brother Godfrey's snoring, turning the distraction into a kind of liturgical duet. He had experimented with sacred listening, where he tried to hear the voice of God speaking through the various sounds of monastery life, including the scratching of rats in the walls and the distant howling of wolves in the forest beyond the monastery grounds. He had also attempted what the monastery's spiritual director called noise fasting, where he deliberately sought out the loudest, most chaotic environments in the monastery and tried to maintain perfect inner calm while surrounded by acoustic mayhem. This involved spending time in the kitchen during meal preparation, when the clatter of pots and pans combined with the shouting of instructions and the general chaos of feeding 100 hungry monks. It meant sitting in the workshop when Brother Marcus was repairing furniture, filling the air with the screech of saws and the pounding of hammers on recalcitrant wood. But perhaps the most challenging aspect of monastic noise management was the complete lack of privacy or escape. In the modern world, when we're driven to distraction by noise, we can retreat to a quiet room, put on headphones, or simply leave the area. Medieval monks had no such options. The monastery was their entire world, and they were bound by their vows to remain within its walls. More importantly, they were required to participate in community activities at specific times, regardless of their personal preferences or tolerance for noise. The daily schedule, known as the Divine Office, required all monks to gather in the chapel 8 times throughout each 24-hour period for communal prayer. These gatherings were supposed to be moments of spiritual unity and divine worship, but they were also acoustic challenges that would test the patience of a saint. 100 men crowded into a stone chapel, all trying to recite prayers in unison, created a cacophony of voices that ranged from melodious baritones to creaky falsettos, punctuated by the occasional cough, sneeze, or stomach rumble. The communal nature of monastic life meant that individual noise tolerance was irrelevant. Brother Aldrich might be particularly sensitive to certain sounds, while Brother Godfrey might be completely oblivious to the acoustic disruption he was creating, but both were required to live together in harmony and mutual tolerance. This created a complex social dynamic where monks had to navigate their personal acoustic preferences while maintaining the charitable attitude toward their fellow brothers that was central to monastic spirituality. The monastery's physical layout made noise control even more challenging. Medieval monasteries were designed as integrated communities, where all the activities of daily life took place within a relatively small, enclosed space. The chapel, dormitory, refectory, kitchen, workshop, scriptorium, and infirmary were all located within the same complex of buildings, often sharing walls and connected by corridors that carried sound from one area to another. The scriptorium, where Brother Aldrich spent most of his waking hours, was particularly susceptible to noise pollution from other parts of the monastery. Located adjacent to the chapel, it received the full acoustic impact of every service, every practice session by the choir, and every enthusiastic celebration of major feast days. The scriptorium also shared a wall with the kitchen, meaning that the peaceful work of copying manuscripts was regularly interrupted by the sounds of meal preparation, dishwashing, and the occasional culinary disaster. The daily rhythm of monastery life created predictable patterns of noise that monks learned to work around, but these patterns were frequently disrupted by unexpected events that could throw the entire acoustic environment into chaos. A visit from the bishop might mean extra bells, special services, and the bustle of preparation that filled the monastery with unfamiliar sounds. A severe storm could set every door and shutter in the complex to banging and creaking, while the rain drumming on the roof created a constant background noise that made concentration difficult. The seasonal changes also affected the monastery's acoustic environment in ways that required constant adaptation. Winter brought howling winds that whistled through every crack and crevice in the ancient stone walls, while the necessity of keeping fires burning in the various rooms added the constant crackling and popping of burning wood. Spring meant the return of birdsong, which sounds pleasant until you realize that dawn prayers coincided with the most enthusiastic period of avian vocal activity, when every species in the surrounding countryside seemed determined to outsing its neighbours. Summer brought its own acoustic challenges, as the warm weather meant that windows and doors were left open for ventilation, allowing sounds to travel more freely between different areas of the monastery. The busy season of farm work also meant increased activity in the monastery's fields and workshops, with the sounds of harvesting, construction, and animal husbandry creating a constant background of rural noise that could be either soothing or maddening depending on your state of mind and the nature of your work. Brother Aldrich had developed his own unofficial methods for dealing with particularly challenging noise situations, though he was careful not to let his innovations contradict official monastery teachings about patient acceptance of all circumstances. He had discovered that certain types of manual work, like grinding ink or preparing parchment, could be synchronized with repetitive noises in ways that made both activities more tolerable. The rhythm of chopping vegetables in the kitchen could be transformed into a meditation aid if you approached it with the right spiritual attitude. He had also learned to use the monastery's acoustic properties to his advantage. The same stone surfaces that amplified unwanted noise could also carry whispered prayers and chanted psalms in ways that created natural sound masking. By timing his vocal prayers to coincide with periods of increased background noise, he could maintain his spiritual practice while partially drowning out the sounds that interfered with his concentration. The most innovative monks had developed what could only be described as medieval versions of noise-cancelling technology, though they would never have described their techniques in such terms. Brother Matthias, the monastery's master carpenter, had discovered that hanging heavy tapestries in certain locations could absorb sound and reduce echo. Brother Jerome had experimented with rearranging furniture and work surfaces to create acoustic barriers that provided small pockets of relative quiet within larger, noisier spaces. The monastery's library had become an informal laboratory for acoustic management, as the monks who worked there were particularly sensitive to noise disruption and highly motivated to find solutions. They had discovered that certain arrangements of bookshelves and reading desks could create natural sound baffles, while the strategic placement of thick manuscripts could absorb some of the noise that travelled through the walls from adjacent rooms. But perhaps the most sophisticated approach to monastic noise management was the development of what modern acousticians would recognise as sound masking techniques. The monks had learned to use pleasant, predictable sounds to cover up harsh or irregular noises that were more disruptive to concentration. The gentle splash of water in the monastery's fountain could mask the sound of footsteps in adjacent corridors, while the soft hum of bees in the monastery's hives provided a natural white noise that made other sounds less noticeable. The monastery's musical traditions also served important acoustic functions beyond their obvious spiritual purposes. The regular practice of Gregorian chant not only fulfilled religious obligations, but also created periods of organized sound that temporarily replaced the chaotic cacophony of daily life with something beautiful and meaningful. The communal singing during services transformed what might otherwise be a confused babble of individual voices into a harmonious expression of shared faith. The bells, despite their capacity for acoustic assault, also served as a form of temporal sound organization that helped monks anticipate and prepare for different types of noise. The specific patterns of bell ringing announced not just the times for prayer, but also the schedule of daily activities, allowing monks to plan their most noise-sensitive work for times when the monastery would be relatively quiet. Brother Aldrich had become something of an expert in the monastery's acoustic microenvironments, learning which locations offered the best conditions for different types of work at different times of day. The corner of the scriptorium near the window provided good natural light for detailed manuscript work, but it was also closest to the courtyard, where the novices practiced their Latin recitations every morning. The alcove near the library's back wall was quieter but darker, requiring the use of candles that created their own distractions through flickering shadows and the constant threat of fire. The social dynamics of monastic noise management were perhaps even more complex than the physical challenges. Monks were required to live in charity with one another, which meant that direct complaints about noise were generally forbidden. Instead, they had to find diplomatic ways to address acoustic problems that didn't violate the principles of humility, patience, and fraternal love that governed monastery life. Brother Aldrich couldn't simply march up to Brother Godfrey and demand that he do something about his snoring. Such a direct confrontation would violate multiple aspects of monastic etiquette and could result in punishment for both parties. Aldrich for lacking charity and patience, and Godfrey for disturbing the community peace. Instead, Aldrich had to find indirect approaches that addressed the problem while maintaining the appearance of spiritual acceptance. This had led to the development of elaborate strategies of hint-dropping, prayer requests, and charitable interventions that were designed to solve noise problems without acknowledging that problems existed. Aldrich might mention in casual conversation that he had been reading about the health benefits of sleeping on one side, hoping that Godfrey would make the connection to his snoring issue. He might volunteer to help rearrange the dormitory furniture in ways that would provide some sound buffering, or offer to trade sleeping locations with brothers whose acoustic tolerance was higher than his own. The monastery's confession system provided another avenue for addressing noise issues, though it had to be approached with considerable delicacy. A monk might confess to having uncharitable thoughts about a brother's disruptive habits, which could lead to a discussion with the spiritual director about both patience and consideration for others. The spiritual director might then find opportunities to address noise issues in general terms during community meetings or private counseling sessions. The seasonal religious calendar provided additional opportunities for addressing acoustic challenges through spiritual means. During Lent, The monastery's emphasis on penance and self-denial created an atmosphere where requests for quiet and concentration were more likely to be honored. The preparation for major feast days required extra copying work and artistic projects that gave scribes and artists legitimate reasons to request protection from noise disruption. Brother Aldrich had also learned to work with the monastery's natural rhythms in ways that minimized his exposure to the most disruptive sounds. He had discovered that the hour immediately after vigils, when most of the brothers had returned to bed, but before the kitchen staff began preparing for morning prayers, offered a brief window of relative quiet that was perfect for delicate manuscript work. The period between noon prayers and evening vespers, when many brothers were engaged in outdoor work or private study, provided another opportunity for concentrated intellectual labor. The changing seasons offered different acoustic advantages that experienced monks learned to exploit. Winter's shorter days meant longer periods of indoor activity, but they also meant that outdoor work ceased earlier, creating more opportunities for quiet evening study. Spring's longer daylight hours increased the overall activity level in the monastery, but they also meant that evening prayers occurred later, extending the period of afternoon quiet. The monastery's agricultural cycle also affected the acoustic environment in predictable ways that could be planned around. Harvest time brought increased activity and noise, but it also meant that many brothers were working in the fields rather than in the monastery buildings, reducing the overall noise level in the scriptorium and library. The winter months, when outdoor work was impossible, concentrated all the monastery's activities within the buildings, creating more crowded and noisy conditions, but also more opportunities for collaborative projects that could benefit from shared workspace. Brother Aldrich had developed a sophisticated understanding of the monastery's acoustic ecosystem, learning to read the subtle signs that predicted changes in the noise environment. The way the wind affected the sounds from the kitchen, the correlation between weather patterns and the intensity of Brother Godfrey's snoring, the relationship between feast day preparations and the overall activity level in the scriptorium. All of these factors became part of his daily planning process. The technological limitations of medieval life meant that monks had to be far more creative and resourceful in their approaches to noise management than modern people who can simply reach for manufactured solutions. But these limitations also fostered a deeper understanding of sound, acoustics, and the relationship between physical environment and mental state that many modern people have lost in their reliance on electronic solutions to environmental problems. The monastic approach to noise management was ultimately about transformation rather than elimination, finding ways to work with acoustic realities rather than against them, and developing the spiritual and psychological resources to maintain concentration and peace, regardless of external circumstances. This approach required a level of self-discipline and environmental awareness that was both more demanding and more rewarding than simply blocking out unwanted sounds. As our tale draws to its close, we find Brother Aldrich completing his copy of St. Augustine's Confessions, just as the monastery bells ring out for morning prayers. Brother Godfrey's snoring has finally subsided, replaced by the gentle sounds of the community awakening to a new day of service and prayer. The rats have retreated to their daytime hiding places, and the acoustic chaos of the night has given way to the organized sounds of liturgical worship. Aldrich carefully caps his ink pot, cleans his quill, and prepares to join his brothers in the chapel for lauds. As he walks through the corridors, he reflects on the night's work and the sounds that have accompanied it. The copying is complete. The sacred text has been preserved for future generations, and he has managed once again to find focus and concentration despite the acoustic challenges that surround him. In the chapel, as the community raises their voices in the ancient melodies of morning prayer, Aldrich realizes that the sounds that had seemed so disruptive during his solitary work have been transformed into something beautiful and meaningful through their collective expression. Brother Godfrey's powerful voice, which had been such a trial during the night, now contributes to the harmonic richness of the community's worship. The rats that had scurried through the walls are silent now, but their presence is part of the larger ecosystem that sustains the monastery's life. The medieval approach to noise management offers lessons that remain relevant in our modern world of constant acoustic assault. The monk's emphasis on adaptation rather than elimination, acceptance rather than control, and community rather than individual solutions provides a model for dealing with environmental challenges that transcends the specific problem of unwanted sound. Brother Aldrich's struggles with Brother Godfrey's snoring and the monastery's acoustic challenges remind us that the fundamental human experience of trying to find peace and concentration in a noisy world is unchanged across the centuries. The tools and techniques may have evolved, but the need for patience, creativity, and spiritual resources in dealing with acoustic disturbance remains as relevant today as it was in medieval monasteries. The monastic understanding that sound is part of the larger fabric of community life, rather than simply a technical problem to be solved, offers a perspective that our modern world of noise-cancelling headphones and soundproofed environments might do well to consider. Sometimes the path to peace lies not in eliminating the sounds that disturb us, but in finding ways to transform our relationship with them, turning acoustic challenges into opportunities for spiritual growth and communal understanding.